They crossed Earth's border once. No ship ever returned. Valith Sorn had spent her entire life reading about war, and she had never once been afraid of anything she had read until today. She sat alone in the intelligence chamber of the Spear of Certainty, the greatest warship the Kreth Dominion had ever built. And she stared at her screen with a feeling she could not name, because her species did not have a word for the thing she was feeling right now. The Kreth Dominion had conquered over 300 species across 4,000 years of unbroken military victory, and in all that time, no enemy had ever made the Dominion pause, and no enemy had ever made the Dominion reconsider, and no enemy had ever made the Dominion feel anything close to doubt. But Voleth was not a soldier, and she was not a general, and she was not someone who confused confidence with intelligence. She was an analyst, and her job was to look at information and find the truth hiding inside it, and right now the truth was telling her something that made her stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. The Dominion War Council had selected their next target for expansion, and that target was a small yellow star called Sol, and the species that lived there called themselves humans, and by every official measure they were nothing special. They had only been traveling between stars for about 300 years, which was practically nothing by galactic standards, and they controlled only one star system, which was laughable compared to the Dominion's thousands, and their population was small, and their territory was tiny, and on paper they looked like the easiest conquest in Dominion history. Grand Marshal Tuvok had assembled a fleet of 1,200 warships for the invasion, which was the largest fleet the Dominion had ever gathered in one place. And when Voleth had asked why such a massive force was needed for such a small target, Tuvok had smiled his sharp Insukdud smile and said it was not about need but about spectacle. He wanted the galaxy to watch, and he wanted every species on every world to see the Dominion swallow another civilization whole, and he wanted the humans to understand from the very first moment that resistance was not just futile but meaningless. Voleth had nodded and said nothing, and then she had gone back to her intelligence chamber and started digging into the galactic archives for everything she could find about Earth and about humans and about Sol's system. And that was when things started to feel wrong. The first problem was the gaps. Every species the Dominion had ever conquered had a file in the Galactic Intelligence Database, and those files were typically massive and filled with details about military strength and fleet composition and defensive capabilities, and cultural weaknesses and political divisions, and everything else an invading force might need to know. The file on humanity was almost empty. Not small and not incomplete, but actively empty, as if information had once been there, and had been deliberately removed, and what remained was a handful of dry facts about human biology, and a note about their atmospheric preferences and nothing else. Voleth searched deeper, and found that other empires had filed intelligence reports about humanity over the centuries, but almost all of those reports were sealed under the highest possible classification level, and the classification tag was one she had never seen before in her entire career. It read existential regret. She did not know what that meant, and she did not like not knowing. She spent hours trying to access the sealed files and failed every time, and she tried alternative databases and found nothing, and she tried intercepted communications from other species and found only silence. And it was as if the entire galaxy had collectively decided to say absolutely nothing about the humans who lived around that small yellow star. Finally buried in an archive so old that most of its data had corrupted beyond recovery, she found one file that was still readable. It was a short message from a species called the Arun Hegemony, and Voleth knew that name, because the Arun Hegemony had once been one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy, and they had controlled over 100 star systems and commanded a military force that rivaled the Dominion itself. They were also extinct. They had been extinct for over 600 years, and no one had ever been entirely sure why, because one day they were a galactic superpower, and the next day their vassal species had risen up in simultaneous rebellion across every one of their worlds, and the hegemony had crumbled like dry sand in a storm. The message from the Arun was short, and it had been written in a format that suggested it was meant as a warning to anyone who might find it, and it said only this: "Do not go to Sol, and they do not conquer, and they do not expand, and they simply ensure you never come back." Vuluth read it 3 times, and then she read it again, and then she saved it to a secure file, and walked to the command deck to find Grand Marshal Tuvok. She found him standing before a massive holographic display that showed the entire invasion fleet spread across the void like a swarm of silver insects, and he was smiling in the way that powerful people smile when they believe the universe exists to confirm their importance. She told him what she had found, and she showed him the Arun warning, and she told him about the sealed files and the empty databases, and the classification tag that read existential regret. Tuvok laughed. He laughed long and loud, and his officers laughed with him, and he told Vuluth that she was an excellent analyst but a poor soldier, because a soldier understood that fear was a weapon, and that the humans had clearly spent centuries cultivating a reputation designed to keep other species away, and that the best way to deal with a bluff was to call it. Vuluth wanted to say that the Arun hegemony had probably thought the same thing, but she looked at the faces of the officers around her, and she saw that none of them wanted to hear what she had to say, and so she said nothing and returned to her chamber. The fleet moved forward. For 3 days it traveled through empty space toward Sol's system, and on the morning of the 4th day, the forward sensors detected something ahead. Thousands of small objects were floating in a perfect sphere at a distance of roughly 2 light-years from Earth, and they were evenly spaced and completely identical, and each one was no larger than a Dominion escape pod. They were beacons. As the fleet approached, the beacons activated, and every single one of them began broadcasting the same message simultaneously in every known language in the galaxy, and the message was simple and clear, and it said, "You are now entering sovereign human space, and this is your only warning, and turn back." Tuvok stood on the command deck and stared at the holographic display, and the 1,200 ships of his fleet surrounded him like a wall of iron certainty, and he gave the order to advance. The fleet crossed the line of beacons and kept going. For a moment nothing happened, and the void was silent, and the stars were still, and the fleet moved forward into the space beyond the beacons as if nothing had changed. And then every single beacon went dark at exactly the same time. 1,200 ships continued forward into perfect silence, and Vuluth sat in her chamber and watched her screens and waited, and she noticed that her hands were shaking, and she could not make them stop. Then something pinged back from the darkness ahead. It was not a weapon, and it was not a ship, and it was not a signal that any system on any Dominion vessel could identify, and it was just a single pulse of something that rippled through the fleet like a heartbeat. And deep in her chest, in a place where logic and analysis could not reach, Vuluth's son understood with absolute clarity that the beacons had not been a warning. They had been a door, and it had just closed behind them. They crossed Earth's border once. No ship ever returned. For the first 6 hours after the fleet crossed the beacon line, absolutely nothing happened, and that was somehow worse than anything Vuluth could have imagined. 1,200 warships moved through empty space in perfect formation, and the stars burned cold and distant around them, and the void was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the silence itself was watching them and waiting for something. The officers on the command deck laughed and joked and told each other that the humans were cowards who hid behind empty threats, and Grand Marshal Tuvok stood at the center of it all with his arms folded across his chest and a look of satisfied contempt on his face. Vuluth did not laugh and she did not joke, and she stayed in her intelligence chamber with her eyes locked on her sensors, because she had noticed something that nobody else seemed to care about. The stars were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, and not obviously wrong, but wrong in the small and subtle way that made the back of her mind itch with unease, because the star positions on her navigation charts did not quite match what her sensors were showing her, and the difference was tiny and almost unperceived. To detect, but it was there and it was growing. She ran a diagnostic on her equipment and found nothing wrong, and she cross-referenced with 3 other ships in the fleet and found that their navigation systems were showing slightly different star positions too. But each ship was showing a different version of wrong, as if each vessel was seeing a slightly different sky. She reported this to the command deck and was told it was a sensor calibration issue and to stop wasting their time. 2 hours later, the fleet tried to contact the Dominion homeworld, and the signal did not go through. This was not unusual in deep space, where communication delays were normal, but the problem was not delay, and it was not interference, and it was not jamming, because all of those things left traces and signatures that communication officers could identify and work around. This was nothing. The signal went out, and it simply ceased to exist, as if the space behind the fleet had become a wall that swallowed everything that touched it and let nothing pass through. The communication officers tried every frequency and every protocol and every backup system they had, and nothing worked. And then they tried something simple and desperate, and they sent a scout ship backward along the path the fleet had traveled to physically carry a message back across the beacon line. The scout ship flew for 4 hours in the exact direction it had come from and found nothing, and the beacons were gone, and the empty space where they had been was just more empty space. And the scout turned around and came back, and its pilot reported with a trembling voice that there was nothing behind them anymore. Not nothing as in empty space, but nothing as in the space itself felt different, as if the geometry of the universe had been quietly rearranged while they were not looking. Valith understood then, and the understanding hit her like a physical blow. They had not entered human space. Human space had entered around them. The fleet was inside something, and that something had no walls and no visible boundaries. But it was there, and it was real, and it was holding them the way a hand might hold an insect between its fingers. She ran to the command deck to tell Torvik, and she never got there because halfway down the corridor every light on the ship flickered once, and when they came back on the destroyer Kreths, Fang was gone. Not destroyed and not damaged and not under attack, but simply absent from the fleet formation as if it had never existed, and the sensors showed nothing where it had been, and no debris, and no energy signature, and no distress signal, and no explosion, and just empty space, where 1,200 crew members had been 1 second ago. The command deck erupted into chaos. Torvik screamed orders, and the fleet shifted into a defensive formation, and sensor operators swept every direction looking for an attacker, and weapons officers charged every cannon and every missile battery on every ship. Then another ship vanished. And then 3 more. Each time it was the same, and there was no warning and no weapon fire and no visible cause, and one moment a warship was there, and the next moment it was not, and it was as if something was reaching into the fleet and plucking ships out of existence with the casual ease of someone pulling weeds from a garden. Torvik ordered the entire fleet into a tight sphere with the flagship at the center, and every ship locked its weapons outward in every direction. And for 6 hours they waited and nothing happened, and the silence pressed down on them like a weight that grew heavier with each passing minute. Then something appeared at the exact center of the fleet formation. It was a ship, but calling it a ship felt like an insult to the concept, because it was tiny and matte black, and no larger than a Dominion shuttle. And it had no visible weapons and no visible engines and no visible anything except a smooth, dark hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had not arrived through normal space, because no one had seen it approach, and the sensors had not detected it, and it was simply there as if it had always been there, and the fleet had formed around it by accident. The black ship broadcast a single message on every frequency simultaneously, and the message was delivered in the Dominion's own language with perfect pronunciation, and it said, "You were warned and negotiations are still available, and you have 1 hour." Torvik stared at the black ship on his display, and Valith could see the fear in him now, because she knew what fear looked like even on a face that had never worn it before, and it looked like a man realizing that the universe was not what he thought it was. But Torvik was a soldier, and soldiers did not negotiate with things they did not understand, and so he did the only thing a man like him knew how to do. He ordered every ship in the fleet to fire. 1,200 warships opened fire simultaneously, and the concentrated barrage was the most devastating display of destructive power the Kreth Dominion had ever produced in its entire 4,000-year history, and enough energy to crack a moon was focused on a single point in space where a tiny black ship sat motionless and silent. The weapon's fire reached the black ship and then it bent. Not scattered and not deflected and not absorbed, but bent as if the space around the ship was curved in a way that guided every beam and every projectile and every missile smoothly and gently around the hull, the way water flows around a stone in a river. And the fire passed around the ship and continued into the void behind it and dissipated into nothing. The black ship did not move and it did not react, and it simply sat there untouched and undamaged, as if the most powerful military strike in galactic history had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. The hour passed. Nobody fired again, because nobody could make themselves give the order, because every person on every ship had just watched the impossible happen, and the impossible had been quiet and calm, and utterly indifferent to their existence. The black ship disappeared the same way it had appeared, which was to say, it was simply no longer there. And then every speaker on every ship on every channel and every frequency began to carry a sound. It was low at first and almost below the range of hearing, and it was a hum that resonated in the walls and the floors and the bones of every living being in the fleet, and it rose slowly in pitch, and it was not mechanical, and it was not electronic, and it was something older and deeper than technology. Valith pressed her hands to the wall of her chamber and felt the vibration moving through the metal, and she recognized the sound not with her mind, but with something buried deep in the oldest part of her brain. It was the sound of something that hunted. And it had found them. They crossed Earth's border once, no ship ever returned. The first ship to come apart was the heavy cruiser Dominion's Wrath, and it happened so slowly and so precisely that for a long time nobody understood what they were seeing. Valith was watching her sensor display when the readings from the Dominion's Wrath began to change, and at first she thought it was another sensor error, because the data made no sense, and what the sensors were telling her was that the ship's hull was separating but not breaking, and not exploding and not cracking under stress, but separating the way a puzzle comes apart when someone lifts the pieces one by one with careful and deliberate hands. She switched to a visual feed, and what she saw stopped her breathing. The outer hull plates of the Dominion's Wrath were detaching from the ship's frame in perfect sequence, and each plate lifted away from the hull with mechanical precision, and floated into the void beside the ship, and held its position there, as if placed on an invisible shelf, and underneath, the first layer of hull another layer was already separating, and beneath that the structural supports were sliding apart, and organizing themselves into neat parallel lines. The ship was being taken apart from the outside in. There were no attackers and no weapons and no visible force doing this, and the hull plates were simply moving on their own, as if the metal itself had decided it no longer wanted to be a ship anymore. And every piece that separated was sorted and organized by material type, and metals drifted into one cluster, and composites drifted into another, and polymers gathered in a third, and it was less like destruction, and more like someone cleaning a room. Valith magnified her display and pushed it to maximum resolution, and for just a moment she saw something on the surface of one of the detaching hull plates, and it was a shimmer that was barely visible, and it moved like liquid across the metal, and wherever it touched the material gave way and separated and reformed, and she understood. Machines. Machines so small that they W. Air invisible to the naked eye, and there were trillions of them, and maybe more, and they were crawling across every surface of the Dominion's wrath, and they were taking it apart atom by atom and molecule by molecule, and they were doing it with a precision that made the Dominion's best engineering look like children playing with rocks. She zoomed out and checked the rest of the fleet, and her blood went cold. It was happening to every ship. Not all at once, but in a wave that moved through the fleet from the outer edges inward, and each ship was coming apart in the same careful, methodical way. And the void around the fleet was filling with neatly sorted clouds of raw materials that floated in perfect geometric arrangements, as if displayed in some vast, invisible museum. On the command deck, Grand Marshal Torvik was screaming. He was screaming orders that no one could follow because there was no enemy to fight, and no direction to run, and no weapon that could target something you could not see. And his officers were staring at their displays with the blank, frozen expression of people whose understanding of reality had been quietly removed and replaced with nothing. And then the first escape pod launched from the Dominion's wrath, and Valith saw it on her screen, and she waited for it to be taken apart too, but it was not taken apart. It was left alone. She watched more closely and saw that the escape pods were deploying before the disassembly reached the crew sections of each ship, and the timing was perfect, and the pods were launching at exactly the right moment to carry their occupants safely away from the ship before the area around them came apart. But the crews were not launching the pods themselves. Something else was launching them, and the pod deployment systems were activating on their own, and the crews were being guided into them by doors that opened and closed in sequence, leading them down corridors toward the pod bays, and the ship was herding its own people to safety before allowing itself to be dismantled. Valith checked the life signs on the pods, and every single one showed healthy living occupants, and she checked the pod systems and found that they had been modified, and their life support had been upgraded to last 10 times longer than standard, and their power supplies had been extended, and their emergency beacons had been enhanced, and someone had reached into every escape pod on every ship in the fleet and made them better. Humanity was not killing anyone. They were destroying every single warship in the fleet, and they were simultaneously saving every single life on those warships, and they were doing both things at the same time with the same invisible machines. And the message this sent was more terrifying than any massacre could ever be, because a massacre would have meant that humanity saw the Dominion as a threat. This meant they did not. This meant they saw 1,200 warships and 100,000 soldiers the way a person might see a child throwing rocks at a mountain. And the response was not anger and not violence, but a calm, patient correction that said, "You cannot hurt me, but I will not hurt you either, and now please stop." On the command deck, Torvik had stopped screaming, and he was standing very still and staring at the display where his fleet was dissolving into organized clouds of sorted material, and his face had changed, and the confidence was gone, and the arrogance was gone, and what was left was something that Valith had never seen on the face of a Grand Marshal before. It was the look of a man who understood that he was small. He turned to his navigation officer and ordered the flagship to ram the coordinates where the black ship had been, and the navigation officer entered the command, and the engines did not respond because the engines had already been taken, and the flagship was no longer a ship, but a slowly separating collection of parts that were being cataloged and sorted by something that did not care about his orders. Valith turned back to her terminal and found a message waiting on her screen. It was addressed to her by her full name and rank, and it said, "Analyst Valith Sorn, and you read the Oron file, and you tried to warn them, and we noticed and stand by. She stared at the message, and before she could react, she felt something take hold of her. And it was not a hand and not a force she could describe, but something gentle and firm that guided her out of her chair and down the corridor and into an escape pod. And the pod sealed itself behind her and launched into the void. She pressed her face to the tiny window of the pod and watched. The spear of certainty came apart in silence, and it was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at because it was the most powerful warship her species had ever built, and it was being reduced to its component atoms with the same care that an artist might use to restore a painting, and every piece was preserved, and nothing was wasted, and nothing was damaged except the idea that it had ever been dangerous. Around her the entire fleet was gone. 1,200 ships had become 1,200 clouds of sordid materials floating in the void like strange sculptures, and between them thousands of escape pods drifted safely, and every pod carried living, breathing crew members who were unharmed and confused and terrified. And then the beacons reappeared. They materialized in a perfect sphere around the wreckage, just as they had been before, and they began broadcasting their message again in every language in the galaxy. But now there was an addition, and at the end of the standard warning, there was a new line written in the Dominion's own language. This was your warning, and there will not be another. Valith floated in her pod among the remains of the greatest military fleet in galactic history, and she looked at the beacons, and she looked at the sordid wreckage, and she looked at the thousands of pods carrying every single soldier home alive, and she understood something that would take the rest of her species decades to accept. The humans had not fought them. The humans had corrected them. And the difference between those two things was the most frightening thing she had ever learned. They crossed Earth's border once, no ship ever returned. 3 months after the fleet was taken apart, the last of the escape pods arrived at the Dominion homeworld of Krethos Prime, and by then the damage had already been done in ways that had nothing to do with ships or weapons. Every single crew member from every single ship had been returned alive and uninjured, and their pods had been guided through space along safe routes that avoided every hazard and every obstacle, as if some unseen hand had drawn a map home for each one of them and filled their supplies and checked their systems and wished them a safe journey. And that was the problem. Because the Dominion had built its entire civilization on the idea that the strong take from the weak, and the powerful consume the powerless, and the universe belongs to those who have the will to seize it. And this idea had worked for 4,000 years, and it had never been challenged, and it had never been questioned, and it had become so deeply woven into the Dominion's identity that it was not just a belief anymore, but a fact as real and as solid as the ground beneath their feet. And then humanity had pulled that fact apart with the same quiet precision they had used on the fleet. The returning soldiers told their stories, and the stories spread across every world in the Dominion, and within weeks every citizen of the Empire knew what had happened, and the effect was not what anyone expected. Some soldiers came back and refused to serve again, and they turned in their rank marks and walked away from military life. And when asked why, they said they could not explain it to someone who had not been there, and who had not watched their ship dissolve around them, while something invisible saved their life at the same time. Some soldiers came back and fell to their knees and declared that humanity were gods, and they built small shrines in their quarters and prayed to the species that had shown them mercy, and they were mocked for this. But the mocking was hollow because everyone knew that what had happened in Sol's system was beyond anything the Dominion could understand, let alone match. And some soldiers came back and simply went quiet, and these were the ones that worried Valith the most, because silence in a Dominion soldier meant that something fundamental had broken inside them, and what had broken was the certainty that they were the strongest things in the universe. The Dominion War Council convened in the deepest chamber of the Imperial Citadel on Krethos Prime, and the session was classified at the highest level, and Valith was called to testify. She stood before the 12 most powerful individuals in the Dominion, and she delivered the intelligence briefing that she had been preparing since the moment her escape pod had launched from the dying flagship. She told them first about the technology. She said that the machines that had dismantled the fleet were operating at a scale of engineering that the Dominion's best scientists could not even theorize about, and that the ability to manipulate spacetime to enclose an entire fleet in a pocket of curved space was not a weapon but a basic infrastructure tool, and that the precision required to disassemble 1,200 warships while simultaneously upgrading and launching escape pods for every crew member implied a level of computational power and material control that was beyond anything in the Dominion's projections for the next 1,000 years. She told them that humanity's technology was not decades ahead of the Dominion, and not centuries ahead, but millennia ahead, and that the gap was so vast that comparing the two civilizations was like comparing an insect to a star. Then she told them about the pattern. She had spent the 3 months since her return researching every species that had ever crossed the Sol exclusion boundary, and she had found 7 confirmed cases spanning 2,000 years, and in every single case, the result was the same. The invading fleet was dismantled without casualties, and the crews were returned home alive, and the invading civilization was left intact and untouched, and humanity did nothing further, and they did not pursue, and they did not retaliate, and they did not demand surrender or tribute or apology. They simply rebuilt their border and waited. But in every single case, the invading civilization collapsed within 100 years of the encounter, and not because humanity destroyed them, but because their own subjects and vassal species and conquered peoples saw what had happened and realized that their masters could be humbled, and that realization spread like fire through dry grass, and rebellions followed, and empires crumbled, and the civilizations that had once been powerful enough to threaten Earth were torn apart from within by the species they had once oppressed. The Oron hegemony had been the most recent example, and now the Dominion was next. Valith looked at the War Council, and she saw that some of them understood, and some of them did not, and she delivered her conclusion in the clearest, simplest terms she could find. Humanity is not a threat, she said, and humanity is a border, and they do not expand, and they do not conquer, and they do not trade, and they simply exist, and they have made it perfectly clear that the cost of crossing their line is everything you are. Not because they will destroy you, she said, but because they will show the galaxy that you can be broken, and the galaxy will do the rest. The chamber was silent for a long time after she finished. Then the Hawks spoke, and there were 5 of them on the council, and they demanded a second invasion with a fleet 10 times larger and weapons, specifically designed to counter the human technology, and they spoke with loud voices and fierce conviction. And they said that the Dominion had never surrendered and never retreated and never accepted defeat. Valith listened to them, and then she asked a single question. She asked them what weapons they planned to design against technology they could not detect or measure or understand, and she asked them how they planned to fight an enemy that could fold space around their fleet like a blanket, and she asked them how many soldiers they were willing to send into the void to be gently, carefully, mercifully taken apart and sent home like children who had wandered too far from their nest. The Hawks did not have answers. The vote was held, and it was not close, and the War Council voted 7-5 to classify Sol system as permanently restricted with no justification sufficient, and the Dominion's official position became that the Sol exclusion boundary was the edge of the known universe and nothing existed beyond it. Valith was promoted to Senior Intelligence Director, and then quietly reassigned to a research post far from the centers of power, where she was given a single task, which was to compile the most complete dossier on humanity that had ever been assembled, not for military purposes, but simply to understand. She spent years on this work, and she searched every archive and every database and every intercepted signal she could find, and slowly, piece by piece, she built a picture of a species that made no sense by any standard the galaxy had ever known. They were powerful beyond measure, and they wanted nothing. They could have ruled every star in the galaxy, and they stayed home. They could have crushed every empire that had ever threatened them, and they chose to save every life instead. And late one night in her small office on a quiet research station, far from anywhere important, Valith found something in the oldest layer of intercepted signals she had ever accessed. It was a fragment of a transmission that predated human spaceflight by centuries, and it had been broadcast from Earth's surface using primitive electromagnetic waves, and it had leaked into the galaxy's background radiation and traveled for thousands of years and been captured by an automated listening post that had long since been forgotten. The transmission was in a human language that no longer existed in its original form, and Valith fed it through every translation system she had, and the system struggled because the language was old and strange. But eventually they produced a translation, and it said, "We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard." Valith sat in the dark for a very long time after reading those words. And somewhere in the quiet of that small office, she began to understand that humanity had not become what they were because they were born superior, or because they had some advantage that other species lacked. They had become what they were because they had chosen to be, and because every step of their journey from a small blue world to the quiet gods of the galaxy had been a choice, and the most important choice they had ever made was the one that no other species in the history of the universe had ever made. They had chosen to stop. They crossed Earth's border once, no ship ever returned. 200 years passed, and the galaxy changed in ways that no one could have predicted, least of all the Kreth Dominion. Valith Sorn had died long ago at the age of 112 in her small office on the research station, where she had spent the last decades of her life, assembling the most complete record of humanity that any species had ever created, and her work had been published after her death, and it had become the most widely read document in Dominion history. It changed everything. The Dominion did not collapse the way the Oron hegemony had collapsed, because the Dominion did something that no galactic power had ever done before, and it chose to change on its own. The process was slow and painful, and it took generations, and there were revolts and resistance and entire worlds that refused to accept that the old ways were over. But the document that Valith had written was so clear and so honest and so unflinching in its assessment that it could not be argued with, and it said in simple terms that the Dominion had two choices. It could continue to be what it had always been and wait for the galaxy to tear it apart the way it had torn apart every empire that had ever been humbled at the Sol exclusion boundary. Or it could become something new. The Dominion chose to become something new. It released its vassal species one by one, and it dismantled its military empire piece by piece, and it rebuilt itself not as a conqueror, but as a scholar and a keeper of knowledge, and the warships that had once carried armies to foreign worlds were converted into research vessels and exploration craft, and the soldiers who had once conquered became scientists and teachers, and the empire that had once taken from the galaxy began to give back. And across the galaxy, the Sol exclusion boundary remained. The beacons still floated in their perfect sphere 2 light years from Earth, and they still broadcast their warning in every language, and ships still came to the edge and looked inward and turned away, because the reputation of humanity had only grown stronger with time, and every species knew the stories and every species understood what lay beyond that line of silent sentinels. But something else had changed too. The beacons were not only broadcasting a warning anymore. Somewhere in the decades after the Dominion fleet was dismantled, the humans had added something to the signal, and it was a continuous stream of data that played alongside the warning like a song playing beneath a spoken word, and the data contained music and mathematics and art and literature and scientific formulas and philosophical writings and histories and stories, and everything that a civilization GHT create over thousands of years of existence. Humanity was sharing itself with anyone who came to the border and listened. They did not trade and they did not negotiate, and they did not ask for anything in return, and they simply broadcast everything they were into the void, and let whoever wanted to listen decide what to do with it. Species began making pilgrimages to the exclusion boundary, not to challenge it, but to sit at its edge and receive, and scholars built stations just outside the beacon line, and spent their lives studying the transmissions, and entire fields of art and science were born from the things that humanity shared, and the border that had once been a wall became a library, and the library was open to everyone. It was into this galaxy that a young Dominion scholar named Kale was born. Kale was a descendant of Valith Sorn's bloodline, and he had grown up reading her work, and he had spent his entire academic career studying humanity from the outside, and he knew more about the species beyond the beacons than perhaps any living person in the galaxy, and he had never once seen a human being. He was 30 years old when the Dominion Council of Scholars selected him for something that had never been attempted in the history of any species anywhere. He was going to cross the Sol exclusion boundary. Not with a fleet and not with weapons, and not with any intention of conquest or espionage, but with a single small unarmed ship and an open request to talk. The galaxy watched as Kale's ship approached the beacon line, and every species that had ever wondered about the quiet gods behind the border held its breath and waited. Kale's ship reached the beacons and the beacons scanned it, and for a long moment nothing happened and the universe was very still. Then the beacons went quiet for the first time in 200 years, and they broadcast a new message, and it was not a warning. It said, "Welcome, and we have been hopping, someone would just knock." Kale's hands were shaking as he guided his ship across the line, and on the other side, something was waiting for him. A fleet of small, luminous drones appeared around his ship, and they moved with a strange, playful energy that reminded him of children, and they danced and spiraled around his vessel and led him forward into Sol's system, and Kale followed them with his heart hammering in his chest. What he found on the other side of the border was nothing like what he had expected. He had expected a fortress world bristling with weapons and technology so advanced it would look like magic, and he had expected cold efficiency and clinical precision, and the quiet, terrifying power that had dismantled 1,200 warships without breaking a sweat. What he found was a garden. Earth was green and blue and alive in a way that took his breath away, and the oceans were clean and deep, and the forests covered entire continents, and the cities were not the towering metal structures he had imagined but low and graceful, and woven into the landscape as if they had grown there naturally, and the whole world looked less like a civilization and more like a living painting. The weapons that had destroyed the Dominion fleet were not weapons at all, and they were environmental systems designed to maintain and terraform and build, and they had been repurposed for defense only when someone crossed the border, and the rest of the time they tended the oceans and grew the forests and maintained the atmosphere and kept Earth alive. Humanity numbered only 2 billion people on the planet, and this was by choice, and they lived in small communities spread across the green and growing world, and they did not work in the way that other species understood work, because their technology did everything that needed doing, and they were free to spend their time however they wished. A human woman named Alara met Kale on a hillside, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. She was not what he expected either, and she was not tall or imposing or radiating power, and she was of average height with brown skin and dark eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and she was wearing simple clothes and her feet were bare in the grass, and she looked like exactly what she was, which was a person who was happy. She offered him tea. They sat on the hillside together and looked at the ocean, and the sun was warm and the wind carried the smell of salt and growing things, and for a long time they did not speak, because the moment did not require words. Then Kale asked the question that every species in the galaxy had wanted to ask for 2,000 years. Why, he said, and why do you stay behind your border, and with your power, you could rule every star in the galaxy." Alara smiled, and she looked at the ocean and the sky and the grass beneath their feet, and she was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was calm and simple. "Why would we want," she said, "and we already have everything worth having, and we went out there once, you know, and we explored and expanded and met other species, and we saw what the galaxy does, and it conquers and consumes and repeats, and we decided we did not want to play that game. And so we came home and drew a line and poured all of our energy into making this one small world as beautiful as we possibly could." She picked a blade of grass and turned it between her fingers. "The border is not to keep you out," she said, "and it is to keep us from becoming you." Kale stayed on Earth for 30 days, and in that time he walked through forests that were older than his entire civilization, and he swam in oceans that were cleaner than any water on any world he had ever visited, and he sat in libraries that contained the collected knowledge of a species that had spent millennia learning and creating and growing. And on the last day, Alara gave him a gift. It was a small sealed container of Earth soil, and inside the soil was a packet of seeds, and Alara told him they were flowers, and that they would grow in almost any soil on almost any world if given water and light and patience. Kale took the gift home. He landed on Krethos Prime to crowds of millions who wanted to hear what he had seen, and he told them everything. And he told them about the green world and the quiet people, and the woman on the hillside who had offered him tea. And he told them what she had said about the border and about the garden, and about the choice humanity had made. And then he did something that no Dominion citizen had ever done before. He went to a small patch of bare ground outside the research building where Valith Sorn had spent her final years, and he knelt down and he opened the container, and he pushed the seeds into the alien soil, and he covered them gently with earth, and he poured water over them. Other Dominion citizens gathered to watch, and they were confused at first, because the Kreth had never grown anything, and their world was hard and metallic, and they had always taken what they needed from others, and the idea of putting something into the ground and waiting for it to grow was strange and unfamiliar. But they watched, and Kale looked up at them and smiled, and said nothing because some things did not need to be explained, and only needed to be shown. Somewhere very far away 2 light years from a small blue world that smelled of salt and green and growing things, the beacons hummed their ancient patient song. A warning and a welcome. A wall and an open door. And the galaxy for the first time in a very long while listened.